Great. Okay. So, hello everyone, and to those who will be watching this back, I just wanted to welcome you all to today's webinar as part of 1804's Future of Work series, and on embracing flexibility, corporate responsibility, and inclusivity. Um, so as the world of work continues to shift, I think it's a really important topic, especially now. And we hope to have a really engaging conversation about how businesses can adapt, but also lead with inclusivity, flexibility, and the importance of corporate responsibility. So we're looking at some strategies, best practices, sharing some experiences, all in the name of the future of work and how work is adapting. I'm going to hand it over to Tamandra, who will be guiding us and moderating the session.
Okay, thank you very much, Raman. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'm really just here to chair and facilitate, so I will introduce the other three speakers. And maybe actually, I had a look at your biographies, and you've all done so much. Maybe I could just introduce you and then ask you each to say maybe a couple of sentences about what you do that's particularly relevant to today, and then we'll start the discussion. So we've got Claudia Jaworska, Robin Beattie, and Anish Hindocha. So maybe actually, I know what I'll do. Maybe we'll start with the opening question, and then on the way into the question, you could give us a couple of sentences about yourself and let that be your little warm up and the warm up for everyone else to have an idea of where you're coming from. So the first question really is a broad one, and as Rama says, this is very timely because there was a great upsurge of interest in companies in social responsibility, and particularly in inclusion and diversity, and there seems to be some pulling back from that at the moment. And I think this is quite interesting because I'm not sure whether it means that there was never really that much commitment to those kind of social values, and as soon as they looked expensive or unpopular with the customers, companies decided to junk them, or whether companies rushed into things just generally thinking, oh, this seems like a good thing, and then realized that actually it was a bit more complicated and maybe they were going to have to think about things in a more complex way. So maybe just to open, to get your thoughts on where we are and what you think it means, the changes that are currently going on. Can I start with you, Claudia?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. I currently work as a leadership coach and also program developer. So basically dealing with program development in the area of leadership and diversity and inclusion. And on very many years, I was on the other side of the business. I was a business strategist, as well as one of my functions was actually a diversity and inclusion champion. And I have seen very many organizations from inside out, and I have seen many diversity and inclusion programs, and from both, as a consultant and as a participant or a person driving them. And I think that what we are observing right now is that a lot of companies indeed have taken a step back, but interestingly, I don't necessarily see this as a bad thing, because a lot of companies did DI in a very fragmented and siloed way, and there wasn't very much strategic approach to that. And from what I've been talking to very many people these days is that maybe this is a chance to give it a reset, to actually allow a lot of companies take a step back, have a more strategic, view what's really needed for the company, how they actually approach this project. I mean, not project like how they approach this topic more meaningfully, making this really, fit for purpose and really connected to their business challenges and their environment.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That was perfect. Robin, can I come to you next? So tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of yourself and why you're here, and then also then zoom out to give us the big picture.
Absolutely, yeah. So my name's Robin Beattie. I've got around 25 years in staffing and talent. We were the organisation I worked with, the first organisation to do a Women in Technology survey, because we really wanted to be able to push that and change that dial. Recently set up a business called Akana, which helps startups scale. But it's also there to talk about DE&I as being a foundation for these organizations as they scale. So if they can get DEI in at the beginning, it makes it a lot easier. What are my thoughts on the big general picture? I agree a lot with what Claudia is saying. I think there's different viewpoints in different geographies. So I think the US may take a different viewpoint to Europe. I was recently over at Unleash, which was a big HR event in Paris. And while Trump was talking a lot about his views on inclusivity, there was a very different message coming out in Europe, which was one that it was going to say that they are absolutely fundamentally behind it. But I do agree with Claudia in this. I think it gives companies an opportunity to reframe how they look at their DEI policies rather than sort of totally abandoning those principles. I think there's an opportunity how to do that reset.
Great, really useful, thanks. So Anish, give us an idea of why you're here and where you come from, and then tell us what you think the current situation can tell us.
Yeah, great, thank you. Thanks for having me as well. So I might be slightly different in that I'm not a DEI expert at all, actually. So it's kind of a privilege to kind of be on this platform with Robin and Claudia as well. So I'm a change consultant, so I'm a change contractor, and I have 20 plus years of experience facilitating teams, within which does bring in an element of bringing in diversity. In fact, my first lesson on that was the 101 facilitation technique, which is try and bring in the quieter ones in a group. If you've ever been in a group and facilitated that's one of the key things you do. You look out for who's actually not speaking. And it was through that I kind of grew an interest for group dynamics. And when it comes to your question then, Timandra, I'm wondering whether I've got a slightly different view, which is I share the positivity from Robin and Claudia in terms of it's a chance to reset. There's also a lot of pressures, particularly on large organizations. And let's face it, it's typically large organizations that have the budget to invest in DEI, in my opinion, at some sort of scale. And I see that cutting back a little bit like some of the well-being initiatives. And there's an awful lot of short-termism around. Things are very uncertain. Budgets are tighter than ever. And it feels to me like whilst there could be a chance for a reset, we do need to be a lot more intentional about it for it to get the stage again in a way that it did a few years ago. So that's kind of my view. It's a little bit agreeing, but I'm a little bit cynical as to whether it will, I think it'll take something different, very different, for us to start to embrace this again properly.
That's great. That's really useful from all of you. And I think also it feeds in really well to what I'd like to ask about next, which, if you like, is the other side of the title of the event, which is about how it relates to flexibility and flexible working. Because I mean, certainly as a long-time freelancer myself, I can see that there are both advantages and disadvantages when you're dealing with flexible and freelance workers. That on the one hand, there's the opportunity to be more dynamic, maybe in your hiring and employing, and be more aware of this kind of issues. But then on the other hand, perhaps there are also things that it's harder to have a conscious strategy about relationships within the workforce. I mean, let's make it as broad as that. So I'd be really interested to get your thoughts on that, specifically on how flexibility relates to these kinds of things. And maybe I'll start with you, Robin, since like recruitment and workforce design. Can I call it workforce design? Is that
you can? Yeah.
Feel free to use that in future on your business cards. Talk to us about how you think flexibility and flexible work in particular relate to these kind of issues and where you see that going.
So I think flexible working arrangements promote diversity. You know, if I look at the startup and scale ups that I work with, a lot of them try to offer those sort of flexible work arrangements, and it does encourage a greater a diverse number of people looking to enter into that from that talent pool perspective. So, you know, I think startups have potentially, down to maybe sometimes cost issues, they don't necessarily have big offices anymore post COVID in their early days. So actually they do look to go to this kind of remote first principle. And by doing that, they definitely, you know, I hire for these organizations, and, you know, the mantra that we focus on is just making sure we attract exceptional talent. You know, that's the most important thing, because that will help with exponential growth. So, you know, what the gender of that talent is, religious orientated, it doesn't matter. We look for exceptional talent. But by being able to have a remote first mentality, it definitely widens that talent pool. So I think that's a big area. Obviously, removing the geographic hiring constraints, again, is a huge part of that. So again, you know, when I speak to clients, you know, we do try and encourage as much as possible that they actually can look at organizations, they can look for people who maybe sit outside of their, you know, immediate proximity. And again, that will give greater inclusion as well to those people. So those are kind of two areas that we look at. I would counter all of that, though. I want to be really honest. I still feel there are a lot of organizations where CEOs are really trying to encourage people back into the workplace. And there is still a very serious train of thought, which is, you can't scale a business unless you're all in it together physically. So there's a balance, I think, to manage on that side of things.
And is that a problem for, if you've tried to use the flexibility to attract, to widen your employment base, as you put it, then if you're trying to pull people back into the office, does there come a crunch point where people say, well, you hired me on the basis that I could work around my other responsibilities, or I could work from where I am, and now you're changing the goalposts?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think it's, so what I do is I make it very clear at the outset to organizations, yeah, this is your talent pool if you want people 5 days a week in the office. This is what your talent pool would look like if you offered hybrid working, and this is what your talent pool could look like if it works remote. I understand that there's pros and cons on each of those. You choose which you want to go with, but I just want to be very clear around this is what the talent pool sizes look like. It gets a bit more problematic when, as you said, if they said, for example, it started as remote first, and then suddenly it could be a change of ownership, it might be a change of C-suite, or something happens, or it may just be that they feel, yeah, they're not getting the productivity they wanted. They will then look to bring people back in. If that's not communicated clearly, you will absolutely see people leave, no doubt.
Anish, I can see you nodding on that. Would you like to come and give us your thoughts on this?
Well, it just reminded me of a story. So, like, a few years ago, just going to build on what you said there, Robin, about people leaving, and maybe add on that. A few years ago, it's working for, I've only ever worked for large companies, so I've not worked with startups. So my experience is based on kind of multinational global firms. And I remember it was kind of that tail end of COVID, and it was looking like we could get back to the office. And I was working with the leadership team there, and the board member at the time delegated the return to office to one of her direct reports. And she said, right, and I quote unquote, 3-line whip, everyone needs to be back in 4 days a week. And you could sense the tension in the room, because it wasn't like there was a unanimous backing for that view. It was slightly awkward. The poor direct report is now thinking, well, I've got to just follow the order here. I know, spoke to me outside the session and said, did you hear what I did? I said, yes, I did. And nothing's going to break trust and morale like absolutely mandating people who have just got used to, maybe have moved house, maybe have gotten themselves into a different caring situation, etc., etc. And so there's this, and of course there's quiet quitting as well that comes along with that. So to Robin's point, people may not actually leave, but it may hurt morale enough, and they may not be leaving, but they might be thinking about it. And if they're not going to leave, what's their productivity like? And I think from the outside looking in, it seems obvious that flexibility, if we mean by flexibility, we mean being able to work from anywhere. And there are many other dimensions to flexibility, of course. But if that's what we're focused on, then it seems obvious to me that that should be a good thing. But yet we're seeing the evidence recently in the headlines is a pushback. So
I'm very torn on this, because even though I'm a freelancer and I've worked from home for years, I also can see that working on projects, even, it's very good often to have people in the same room. So I have some sympathy for the managers, but I also very aware that people who could work from home during COVID, and obviously, half the population couldn't, because they go out and do real jobs, not like us laptop jockeys. But the people who could work from home, often, as you say, they had new caring responsibilities. Suddenly, the family dynamics may have shifted, and maybe the father is doing the school run twice a week, or they've got a puppy, which is less of an issue. But and as you say, people moved house, so people's circumstances changed, and priorities maybe changed, and they didn't want to change it back. So, Claudia, what do you think? Can flexibility help with these issues? Are there times when they come into when flexibility and social responsibility and inclusion come into conflict?
Yeah, that's. I've been listening to all of you, and I really have thoughts on each side. There's so many pros and cons, because I'm probably personally a little bit biased, because I worked for most of my life for technology companies, which enabled working, hybrid or whether online, for very many years before COVID. So we always had that flexibility. Which we did not always choose, because for very many reasons there's always benefits of going to the office, right? And I agree, there's so much that you learn from people in the office, just learning just by working with someone, conversations in the kitchen, those or informal connections which you just cannot have when you have this online schedule. And everything is an hour to an hour, and people basically don't have that time in between. And that's also that time in between is where creativity boosts, right? And where you have those conversations where you get inspired, when you exchange your thinking, when you actually go for someone for lunch, and instead of talking about lunch, then you start talking about a project. So these are all those moments which I highly appreciated when I did go to the office. Having said that, I worked for I had a session with a client a couple of weeks ago, and they all are forced to go back to the office 5 days a week, and they commute a long way, some of them, to get to that office, and they are horribly unhappy about that. They it's not a company that's very modern in their thinking, let's be honest. They said so far they've applied for a change of the policy, but it hasn't changed. So what I would say is that I would always be mindful of what people want, and really go into the data, and as much as possible ask people what is the preferred solution for them, because sometimes a hybrid basically solution is might work best, right? A couple of days in the office and 3 days of at work, at home, because there are indeed very many benefits to that. And from what I'm hearing from people, especially the younger generation, is that it's a top motivator after salary for them to join a company, that they actually can have flexible arrangements. So
this brings us on actually very nicely to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is there's obviously some tension for companies between them doing what makes them a business, so productivity, making money, expanding, those kinds of priorities, and the priorities of having a happy workforce, and thinking of that not just as a means to people being more productive, but also as part of a wider social value, if you like, the corporate responsibility idea. So maybe just continuing with you, Claudia, but then I'll also come to you two others to think about how can companies manage that? Is it just inevitable? There's always going to be some kind of tension between those two things, if you like, the company's commercial imperatives and the more social imperatives, or are there ways that companies can find they're pursuing both in the same direction, if you like?
I would think that there's always going to be a little bit of tension, but the tension is not necessarily, again, a bad thing, as long as we include some other factors. And when I think, about inclusion, is really inclusion those differences that those variables where people, which people need to actually be happy and satisfied at work. And for some people that might be flexible work arrangements. For other people that might be, for example, that ability to drive impact and take part in social corporate responsibility events, or be a volunteer. So there's very many things that make people happy, but a lot of the things, of course, could be measured, and we know for sure what actually does drive employee engagement and motivation. And there will be psychological safety, that will be feeling included, that will be joint decision making. There will be all that climate that includes the differences that people actually be themselves. So because you can have diverse workforce, but if you don't account for their differences, if they don't feel appreciated, if they cannot share their opinions, then there will be, or if there's basically, high level of fear, then all that effort that you make into building a diverse workforce is actually quite wasted, right? And when I think about the diverse workforce, it's naturally there's so many factors which can fall under that. But for example, I was thinking right now about like a different way of thinking. I mean, like the cognitive diversity or neurodiversity, or not necessarily just the diversities that we traditionally looked at years ago.
So it's not just, oh, you've ticked all the boxes and now you all look very nice and different on the corporate photo, but actually, do we have room for people with even different values and priorities and different things that make them tick?
Absolutely. And this is, I think, Anish, you mentioned as a facilitator, you look for diverse voices, right? So this is actually the approach that I like most about diversity, is that systemic voices approach, right? So which voice do we look into? Which voice has not been included or has not spoken, so that we actually do keep including, because to me, inclusion is a mindset. It's not about looking who's excluded, but it's meaning like, oh, what dimension like of diversity is excluded, but it's more about like, what else do we include? And that is, as we adapt as an organization, we have to include more and more.
Yeah, lovely segue. So you're doing my job for me now. I was going to come on to you, Anish, and say, what do you think of this? Is there inevitably a tension between commercial imperatives and more social imperatives, or is it possible to harness them both in the same direction?
Should be possible, right? I mean, you've only got to look. I mean, you've got to go to the extreme example of, think of an organization that is profitable because it's socially responsible. I mean, that is why it exists. That's its entire purpose for doing what it does. And if I think of an example that I have in my head at the moment, it's a UK bank. I don't know, but it's a bank, right? And all the headlines for banks are, banks are evil, banks are money grabbing, banks are gonna, it's a hire and fire culture, and it has a reputation for some of those, let's say in air quotes, more toxic elements of culture, right? I've worked for a bank, I've seen the good and bad. But the bank I'm thinking of is Triodos or Triodos. You may have heard of it. And that's a bank that has ethical investment at the part of it as a core of its strategy. That is what it does. It truly believes that. And is it the most profitable bank in the world? No, but it's certainly profitable, and it hires based upon those principles. It invests based upon those principles, and I think the mindset that you mentioned there, Claudia, could be translated as, we've got to stop thinking of these things as like cost centers. If you're in a big organization, it's well-being's a cost center, or diversity and inclusion is a cost center. It's going to cost the business. Well, that's the first thing to go then, isn't it? Because it's going to hurt. But if it's more a center of innovation, and we can grow from the point of view of, let's look at the next generation coming into the workplace, the Gen Z or Gen Z, however you want to pronounce it, they'll sniff out some of this fake stuff in a second, and if you're pretending to be socially responsible, and actually you're not, they're probably not going to stay with you. So there's a little bit of I'm seeing, at least speaking to people in the space, a bit more of a trend towards, I need to be employed by an organization that genuinely, authentically has that at its core. So my advice would be, if you're going to do this seriously, then put CSR in your strategy. Embed it don't put it as a cost center. It needs to ripple through, and we're into line management and leadership obviously as well now, aren't we? So that's kind of my take on it. I think you can have both, but you've got to be really intentional about doing it. Otherwise, people will just, dismiss it as it's another one of those posters, as we see. So, yeah.
So, Robin, what do you think? Is this the way forward? That if you actually embed these values, you are then also going to attract the workforce you want and meet your commercial goals?
Well, yes. But I tell you what did I say is interesting about cost, because I was reading something this morning which I hadn't realized, but there's $1 trillion a year is spent on burnout costs. So you think about the cost of the actual, setting these programs up, and you weigh that up against the $1 trillion just on burnout costs. I bet it's a huge disparate number, from that side of things. So that's something that I think a lot of organizations need to take into consideration. I think this idea that, mental health programs are a perk, I don't see it that way, right? They need to be. And in fact, if anything, I think they're more part of a retention strategy now that you see that. And I think, as Anish said, the Gen Zs are looking at organizations through a very different lens. And I'll take it from the startup scale-up side of things. So I've worked with startups and scale-ups for 15 years. And I would say 15 years ago, a lot of those organizations, a lot of those founders said, whilst we think it's a great idea that we do D&I, we don't have the time, we don't have the funding to do it. So, we just can't think about it right now. And you look at the founders of today, the newer, younger, potentially founders who are coming through, they don't see it that way. They literally see it as though it should be embedded in the DNA of their culture, of their business. So, maybe I'm looking at it through slightly rose-tinted glasses, but I do believe that with the right communication, I think more and more organizations are seeing that you can have corporate social responsibility aligned with business objectives as well.
Brilliant. Well, I think in that case, it's a good time to turn to some slightly more practical and hands-on aspects of this, and get from all three of you suggestions for what exactly can companies or even consultants or other organizations do to foster a culture, but also to practically implement strategies to have this more diverse, inclusive, sustainable and productive workforce to pull all these things together? Maybe I'd start with you this time, Anish. Give us some practical proposals.
I'd love to, but I'm
or
really
things
interested.
you wished companies had done when you were working for them, maybe.
Yeah, I can only think of one. And you know, if there was something that said, have we got DEI wrong? Have we done it wrong? Back to that first question, should we reset? Then I'd be really interested to see what would come out of that. One of the areas I think where naturally organizations start with is training, and it's a step. I'm not going to knock it. I mean, and it should stay, right? The whole thing around unconscious bias and ESG groups is not a bad thing. I'm not saying that for a second. It's just that when we start to measure things based upon who attended the training and how many people, does it go far enough is what I'm wondering. You know, how do we go beyond training? It's not a great answer, but it's a kind of question to a question, and my only half answer is maybe we need to do more with line managers. And there is a very functional role that a line manager plays, and then there's the human role that they play, and the need to emotionally check in with their people, I think, is something that could form a bigger part of line manager education. That's all I have to kind of say on that, really. I think there's something there in terms of just getting more human connection from line management.
That's very interesting what you say about training, because I have seen some evidence that was quite surprising that when you decide that your whole workforce is going to have unconscious bias training or whatever, that not only are there not always the tangible results you want, but in some cases there have been results the other way, that actually people, I'm not sure what's going on there, but that in fact people's behavior and attitudes become less of what you'd want after the training. And so the idea that you put everyone through some kind of attitude training like a sausage machine and they'll all suddenly become nicer and more tolerant really doesn't seem to be something that works in practice, however well-meaning it is. You're now going to, Claudia and Robbie, you're now going to say, actually, we have highly successful compulsory training programs. That's exactly what everyone wants, aren't you? No, you're not. Okay, Claudia, tell us what practical things should companies be doing?
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. I mean, like there could be some successful training programs on bias, but a lot of them are not successful. And maybe before I even give practical examples, I would say that, and we've said that already, that the DEI is a systemic process, and it really needs to be linked to the strategy. So I'm always very hesitant to give best practices, because it always relates to what is needed in your company. What do you need? What are your challenges? Because each company will be different. They'll be working in different environments, different industries. They will have different workforce, not to mention different geographies, right? And I worked for very many years in Asia Pacific, and DEI was treated very differently there to currently where I'm based in Europe. So definitely not one size fits all, because DEI strategies need to be really fit for purpose. So first of all, treat it like the business strategy, and when you do that, there's a high likelihood that you're not gonna get that wrong, right? Because if you treat that as a business process, and you assign KPIs and you look into your challenges, and then you basically plan your actions based on those challenges, then you'll get it right. But having said that, there are some steps which we can take, and the first one I would say is do some pilot programs. Identify your most important needs, address most common issues, look at the data, what your data says. And there's a number of data points which we can look at. And we already mentioned the employee engagement, but that's the very important one. I think right now we are hitting like one of the highest numbers of employee disengagement ever. I think that over 60% of people are disengaged. Only I think 15 people are engaged. You know, that's a huge number to work with. You know, all those disengaged employees, right? Yeah, I'm actually looking at the data right now. It's 62 are not engaged, 15 are actively disengaged, and only 23 are engaged. So that is such a waste to the company, right? When we don't have engaged people, because you know they come to work, but they don't give full percent of what they could be giving to the company, and that's obviously due to very many reasons why people don't do that. So, but you know, if we identify why people are disengaged, and again, there'll be different reasons in each company, then, you know, if we hit that, if we nail this, then, you know, then we can basically design our programs based on those responses. And for sure, what usually works is, I would say coaching programs work, mentoring works, and that could be like mentoring, reverse mentoring, that is working with disadvantaged groups in a way like you Anish mentioned, like ERG groups. And yes, employee resource groups are great because then we get a lot of feedback what's needed for those underrepresented groups, and then they can also give us ideas. I always like to listen to actually the voices of people in the organizations. Like, what do they say? Where, you know, where the issues and the problems are. A lot of them come from the management, from the leadership teams. They are not listening. They, you know, they put a lot of pressure on the teams, but in fact, they don't want to hear, you know, the answers. So leadership training is very important. Because, you know, we did say that bias trainings may not be important, but training in general, if it's good training, it's the key of the foundation actually of the you know, the diversity and inclusion work. But those programs need to be really designed purposely.
I love how there's one of the emerging themes this afternoon is why not ask people and listen to what they tell you. I love it when it comes down to, yeah, you could just ask them and see what they say and listen to the answers. So Robin, what do you think what kind of practical things? I mean, obviously you're in a slightly different position in that you, if you like, are, I don't want to say pipeline, I think that's rather reductive, but you're a kind of a communication system between companies saying we want to change the way we hire and the people we hire and the people they're trying to hire, and they're in the middle. You are there going, well, how about this? So what are some of the very practical things that you're doing and that other people could be doing?
I think there's a couple. There's two trends that I'm kind of beginning to see at the moment. They're kind of disrupting the workplace a little bit, and the first one is kind of like this digital disconnect. You know, when can you actually say you don't want to receive emails? So it's kind of like, I think in France now they have that after work no emails, right to ignore emails, I think it is, and I believe the UK is reviewing that as a policy as well. So that will be very interesting in the digital world that we live in today, where everyone is connected and people communicate at all hours every day. Having that right to ignore would be an interesting disruption to the workplace in that respect. And the other one I think is actually around measuring productivity by outcomes, not by the hours that you work. And there has been that there was a recent project where a number of UK-based companies embarked upon a 4-day working week. And actually those companies, I think 93% of those who embarked on that project have continued the 4-day working week. And actually they saw productivity increase by 20% as well. I'm not sure we're quite ready, all of us. A lot of CEOs I know will fall off their chair right now if I suddenly proposed a 4-day working week. but that's a trend that I think more and more people will explore, and that would foster better well-being, for people.
Well, interestingly, I have a slightly unusual example of that, which is my cousin who's an electrician, usually in a factory, but at one point they laid some people off, and he ended up working a building site a very long way from home. So like overnight stay, go away for the week, work there, go home at weekends. But he wanted to spend more time with his grandkids. He absolutely dotes on his grandkids. So he organized, he was obviously leading a team on this big construction job, and he organized that they would just basically work like stink for 4 days, do really long days, because they were all staying away from home in boring hotels. None of them were particularly excited about being away from home, so they just worked 4 really long days, and then they all went home on Thursday night or Friday morning, whenever it was. So they did a 4-day week. They did the same number of hours, and they were just as productive. But certainly he was very happy to get the day then to spend with his grandkids, and presumably all his colleagues also were much happy to have an extra day at home. So it's perhaps a slightly unusual example of that. But that was very much him saying, well, I don't particularly like staying this far from home. I want to be spending time with my grandchildren. And we can do the same amount of work in a concentrated period of time if everyone on the team is up for it. So there you go. You can use that example to propose it to employers.
Yeah, one of the other things that we did, so we actually did go back and ask our teams, what would they like to see different? What we could do that would be cost effective, but potentially give a bit of impact to that well-being. And actually, one of the things that they came back with, he asked for no sort of internal meetings on a Friday. Which was fine. That was that was very cost effective, from our side of things. But I think sometimes, I was a director at the time, and you probably didn't realize potentially sometimes the angst and concern that people have around internal meetings, and just having that day where that was completely free of internal meetings. Anything that was very serious, we could contact via email or whatever, but you could pick that up again on a Monday morning. That meant a lot to the team. So that's a very cost-effective potential opportunity as well.
And between just a comment between those two examples of having a rule of a no meeting Friday or a no email Wednesday, and a leader like the electrician who effectively says we'll work like stink and then we'll just take the 5th day off. What I've seen is the second example tends to gain more traction, because let's be honest, it's much easier when the leader does it. And I remember somebody I used to work with, and he saw everyone working in their lunch hour. This is back pre-COVID, and he just went out running not because he wanted to run, because he wanted to demonstrate to his team that it was okay to take an hour off at lunch. It went from 2 people to 20 people, and it was enough of a signal to go, I'm doing it. You guys got no excuse. I do not want you going towards anywhere like burnout. And I'll set the example. And that's what your electrician cousin has done as well. And I think that's so powerful. And I just think that's weaving it into the culture, really.
Okay, we're starting to run out of time. I would like to leave a little bit of time for questions, but also I'm aware there's a lot we haven't covered yet. So maybe could I ask the 3 of you to kind of, and I also I don't want to, if there's other stuff that you are really burning to stay, then say it now. But I'm interested in kind of throwing it forward to the future, because we started off with things have changed quite a lot in this area really over the last year or so. I would say there's been a kind of a change of direction, a change of mood, and I'm glad to know that we don't think that's all negative. But maybe could we look forward over the next few years and get an idea of where you think things might be going and where you would like them to be going? If you could, put your hand on the wheel a little at this point, which way would you like to steer it? Can I start with you, Anish, since you've
I think the long term I'm optimistic about. I think the short term I think could be bumpy. I think there's seeing, I mean, yes, in the US particularly, there's a bit of blowback around what's going on there with the presidency and people affiliating themselves with a certain posture. But I think we'll get past that. Diversity isn't going anywhere. It needs to be reset, as we said, as Claudia mentioned and Robin did at the top of this. But just we got to think about it in a different way. So yeah, I'm positive about the longer term, but road bumps along the way.
Okay, that's good to hear. What about you, Robin?
Yeah, I think following on from an initial comment there, we need to move on from this very short-termism kind of mode that we've set ourselves into for quite some time now. And when we can start to look a bit more at long-termism, then I think, yeah, the future is definitely brighter. I would say this, I think we need to position DEI strategies around the competitiveness for talent. I think there is going to be a much greater demand for exceptional talent. I think you're going to see companies hire fewer people, but in their mind, hire better people. So, better doesn't mean necessarily more experienced. It just means more exceptional talent that they will look for. So I think, given that, I think organizations are going to have to really consider what those people will want to join that organization, and flexibility and remote working and other sort of DEI strategies will probably form a large part of that. So I think short term, I think Anish is right. There's a big movement, especially US based, that's kind of pushing back against this. Long term, I think organizations are going to have to get very real, that if they really want the very best talent, they are going to have to be more flexible around what they're offering.
And if they want to hire people who've got used to the idea that maybe you should have flexible hours, that you should be able to work remotely, then they are going to have to, the companies are going to have to also be a bit more flexible, maybe.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, Claudia, what's your vision of the future? You don't have to go 50 years ahead, just maybe a few years, and where you think you'd like it to be going.
Where I would like to be going is probably I would like the world to be a bit less anxious than it is right now, and slightly more comprehensible. Not sure whether that's gonna go this way, but what I'm seeing is that those organizations will be on the win side, which will find a way to stay to keep that growth mindset, right? And in order to keep that growth mindset, they need to be more inclusive, because they will need to find ways to systematically listen to people, to actually, teach the leaders and the employees, active listening, to be able to have that dialogue and facilitate a lot of more conversation than currently we have in the organizations. And that will also require probably a more, not just systemic approach, but even like change management approach, right? So we will be building coalitions, we will be building partnerships, and that means that those processes will be by default more intentionally designed. So I'm hoping for more democracy basically in the organizations, but democracy and voice given to many more people than currently we have.
Marvelous. Systematic listening. We're coming up with lots of really memorable phrases today, which is great, I think. So we have a couple of minutes left, I think. I'm not sure how we get questions, whether people just need to appear and stick their hands up, or if they can appear in the chat. Raman, how are we going to get questions, if there are any questions?
There's a couple of questions in the Q&A section, but I'll paste them into the chat.
That would be great, because I don't think I can see the Q&A section. Aha, there we go. This is great. It'd be good to hear what all three of you think about this. Two really good questions. Thank you, whoever put these questions in. Businesses often use data-driven metrics to measure DEI processes, but are there other better ways to measure without reducing real human experiences to just KPIs or percentages? great. Relates to something you were saying earlier, Claudia, about on the one hand, you can look at the data, but on the other hand, you need to work with specific companies, specific issues. And the other question is, what's a common myth about flexible work and DEI you think is important to debunk? So maybe, because we have about, actually, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. Yeah, maybe I could just get from each of you your thoughts on one or other, or both, if you have thoughts on both those questions. Who'd like to go first? Robin, you did a movement and you highlighted you on my screen, so there you are. You're in.
So let me get this right. It's a bit that I'm struggling to see the questions myself. So could you?
They're in the chat. If you can see the chat.
This is oh, here we go. Often use data-driven metrics to measure DI processes, but are there better ways to measure without reducing real harm? It's an interesting one, right? That because a lot of what I talk to organizations about is being more data-driven. I try and persuade people to stop thinking less with their gut and more be data-driven around their talent strategies and how they hire. So it would be a bit strange for me then to suddenly go, but don't be data-driven around this. So
you're allowed to disagree with the question. That's
yeah.
We've just said we want constructive listening, a diversity of viewpoints. So you're allowed to say, I think you're wrong.
Well, I would say this. I am a huge proponent of data-driven metrics. So I would look for data-driven. I think it does give you a good starting point, and it does give a good narrative that you can follow through. It shouldn't be as black and white as that, because the world isn't like that. But I think it does give a good starting point. So I will disagree slightly too.
Okay, good, excellent. I love a bit of disagreement. It's the fuel of a discussion. Okay, Anish, what are your thoughts on data-driven measurement and or what's a common myth about flexible work?
Yeah, some of the most powerful stuff I've done has not been done through data. It's been done through voice of employee stuff. It's all qualitative. It's anonymous but speech bubbles, and it's a real directional thing for leaders to hear again and again with the volume turned up to 10, that actually we are siloed, we are broken, collaboration is a value, but we ain't practicing it. Because it starts to design interventions to go, how can we solve that and in a meaningful way without having KPIs, etc. So I think we can get very numbers driven in the West, particularly a very rational way of thinking about things, and I think there's a lot to be said around get down to the employee and ask them what they really think, is what we said earlier on. Common myth about DEI I think you surround yourself with people that might think like you, and that's a danger too. But I think there's a common myth that everybody wants flexible working. Maybe that's not true, actually. Maybe some people show my age here. I may have lost touch with some of them who actually crave going into in fact, I know somebody who is the same age as me, and she is desperate to get back into the office. She works in a remote first culture, and that's led by the CEO, who doesn't see the need for everyone to go back in, but she really does want that social connection and strongly believes you get more innovation that way as well. So I think it's a myth to think everyone wants flexible working. Not everyone does. Some people do want to go in and
on that one there, I spoke to an AI fintech, so a very small business, but again, they've actually gone more into the office because actually their employees, they're not the founders, the employees have actually wanted to go more in the office because they said it gives them the spark of innovation. But I think you've got to make it important. There's reasons why you go into the office, not just because it's mandated, but actually encourage it, make it a place that there is a hub of innovation, And I think if you do it in that way, then I think you're right. I do agree about that myth there. I don't think everyone wants there to be, wants to work fully remote. I know I don't. I can say that specifically, yeah.
I heard an interesting thing again coming out of COVID, that whereas especially older, more senior management who had already kind of got their they knew what was what at work, and they knew how it worked, and they already had relationships with the people that they worked with. And also they were much more likely to be living in a big house with a new Labrador, and they were very happy to carry on with and possibly do the school run, and they were very happy to carry on with remote working, whereas younger employees who maybe, especially in cities, were in shared accommodation and lacking, and at the time of life when they wanted to make new social contacts, and also where at work they wanted to learn how everything worked and who everybody was, and they were much more keen to get back in. So I don't know if that's still the case. We're rapid running out of time now. So Claudia, we've also got a couple of new questions in, so feel free to answer any of them, possibly not all of them, but as well as the one about the myth and the one about data, there's two more. One is, do we feel that flexible and remote working options support neurodiversity, and has this been overlooked? And finally, if you could give one piece of advice to businesses who are serious about a truly inclusive and flexible work environment, what would it be? So feel free, you've got the last couple of minutes to sum up the whole event and answer any of those questions. All yours.
I will start with the debunking, because one data point made me think about whether actually that is true that people want to go back to the office, and that's actually feeling of being lonely, the loneliness. Yeah. So it's actually much higher for those who work from home. So 25 people who work from home experience loneliness on daily basis versus 16% of people who go to the office. So that number is significant. Of course, it's not just the only number, but it's worth considering for those who actually think that that might be a case for them. And then about one piece of advice to businesses, I actually would really, again, advise to ask the business what it means to be inclusive in your organization, or what elements of inclusion could be enhanced, or what elements of inclusion could be supported, because there's so many of them, there's so many different aspects which come into inclusion that it's actually difficult to give one strategy. But would that be more about about respect? Would that be more about like autonomy, or about the feeling of belonging, or maybe being authentic, or maybe about the trust and openness in the office, so on the team? So there's many ways we can look into that, but it's always good to check with how people feel. Do you feel like our organization is an inclusive organization, right? Do we have systems for inclusive decision making, for sharing voices, for sharing opinions? Do we have an organization where we feel safe to collaborate and take risks? So these are the things that I will look into, and probably you can't go wrong with them on the top of some other strategies. And then the last question, whether the flexible remote working options support neurodiversity. I personally think yes. Because that's what I've been hearing from many people who are neurodiverse, that being able to work from home without that stress of going to the office and being surrounded by people is actually favorable for them. But again, it doesn't mean that those people don't like collaboration, right? They maybe we can set ways to collaborate with them, either in a hybrid style, or doing this online. There's so many online tools right now, how we can collaborate, how we can collect opinion sharing, knowledge sharing, so and boost creativity as well. So hopefully I have answered that.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you all very much. It's been really interesting and wide-ranging, and lots of new ideas and lots of nuance, which is always good. So if we were all in the room now, I would ask you all to thank our fantastic panel, Anish Hindocha, Robin Beattie, and Claudia Jaworska. So we'll all just have to imagine the wild applause, and then imagine going for a coffee and a biscuit and a discussion afterwards. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, or if you're watching on catch up, evening, morning, or whatever time it is where you are. And thank you, panel, for being absolutely brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.